Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to a world of crowns, castles, and candlelight, where kings sat on thrones, looked terribly important, and then spent most of their private lives making awkward decisions about who to sneak into bed with. So, if you've dimmed the lights, set your phone to night mode, and pulled the blankets up, let's start unraveling the calm, occasionally absurd story of why medieval kings seem to collect mistresses the way some people collect ceramic teapots. It's a funny thing. For centuries, official history focused on wars, treaties, coronations, but behind all the banners and shining armor was a quiet and steady presence of royal mistresses. They were sometimes powerful, sometimes ignored, sometimes just names on a list, but they shaped dynasties in ways their husbands' endless justs never could. And yet, very few kings ever admitted they had one, even when the entire court knew. It was one of those medieval open secrets, like the king definitely smells weird, or the bread is mostly sawdust. Now, you might be wondering, why so many? Why wasn't one queen enough? The official excuse was usually dynastic. Queens were expected to produce heirs, and if they couldn't, or the king thought they weren't producing them fast enough, well, he could always seek comfort elsewhere. Comfort, of course, being a delicate term for what everyone knew it meant. But the truth went deeper. These kings were often bored, insecure, and surrounded by flattery. They lived in a system where being faithful was almost considered suspicious. Imagine being a medieval monarch. You're raised from birth to believe you are divinely chosen, that everyone must bow to you, and that your word is law. The queen you're married to? She was picked for you when you were a teenager, usually because her father owned more cows than you did. And you're supposed to spend the next 40 years with her, attending feasts, watching tapestries being woven, and occasionally producing a child. It's no wonder so many kings decided variety was in order. Take, for example, the French kings. France practically institutionalized a mistress. By the time you get to the Renaissance, they even had an official title for the leading mistress, Maitresse in titre. It sounds fancy, but really it was just a polite way of saying the king's favorite side project. These women often had more influence than ministers, and sometimes even more than the queen herself. Queens, of course, were expected to sit there gracefully, smile politely, and pretend that none of this was happening, which, I suppose, is one way to spend your evenings. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The roots go back to the Middle Ages, when the church officially frowned on adultery, while unofficially, well, they looked the other way if you had enough gold. Kings were supposed to embody Christian virtue, but kings also had armies, and priests tended to prefer their heads still attached to their bodies. So sermons might mention purity, but somehow they always stopped short of saying, "By the way, Your Majesty, maybe stop fathering children with half the duchesses in France." The irony here is delightful. Publicly, kings wrapped themselves in piety. They attended mass, built cathedrals, donated to monasteries, while privately writing letters to their mistresses that range from awkwardly poetic to downright embarrassing. If you've ever read a king's love letter, you know what I mean. Most of them sound like they were written by men who had never spoken to a woman, without a squire standing nearby. And yet, those letters often survived, tucked into archives, reminding us that kings, for all their titles, were just as clumsy as anyone else when it came to romance. Henry II of England is a fine example. Married to Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women in Europe, he still found time for Rosamund Clifford, the famous Fair Rosamund. She was described as breathtakingly beautiful, though we should take that with a grain of medieval salt. Beautiful in the 12th century might just mean had most of her teeth. Nevertheless, Henry adored her. The story goes that he even built her a maze-like house at Woodstock to keep her hidden, a literal labyrinth for a mistress, which, in hindsight, feels a little impractical. Because if you need an elaborate puzzle to protect your relationship, maybe things aren't going that well. Naturally, the court found out anyway. Eleanor was not exactly the forgiving type. She allegedly tracked Rosamund down and offered her a choice, a dagger or poison. Now, historians doubt the story is true. It has that suspicious sound like a ballad quality. But it shows how mistresses were woven into legend. They weren't just women in private chambers. They became symbols of scandal, rivalry, and intrigue. And for Eleanor, the idea of being humiliated by a younger, prettier woman wasn't something she was going to laugh off. Then there's Edward III of England. Now, Edward actually loved his wife, Philippa of Hainaut. By all accounts, theirs was a rare royal marriage that was affectionate. But even Edward had a mistress, Alice Perrers. Alice wasn't noble. She was a widow, probably chosen for her quick wit and beauty. She became incredibly influential, so much so that she was practically running royal business by the time Edward was old and feeble. Parliament despised her. Chroniclers called her greedy, manipulative, and shameless, which, to be fair, she probably was. But she was also a woman surviving in a system that gave her power only through charm. Alice ended up banished after Edward's death, but for years she was the most important woman in the kingdom. Except, of course, for the wife sitting in the background, politely embroidering something. And this was the strange paradox. Queens had official power. Mistresses had unofficial power. Sometimes the unofficial was far greater, because while a queen could issue orders on parchment, a mistress could whisper in the king's ear after dinner. And whispering, as it turns out, often got things done faster. It's tempting to imagine mistresses as simply romantic partners, but more often they were political tools. Noble families pushed their daughters into the king's bed, hoping to secure favor. Kings themselves often used mistresses to balance power at court, rewarding allies or punishing rivals by choosing which women to elevate. So, when we ask why medieval kings had so many mistresses, part of the answer is because politics made it convenient. It was a softer form of bribery, with slightly more candlelight. Of course, not every king managed this gracefully. Some were utterly disastrous. Charles VI of France, nicknamed the Mad, sometimes forgot who he was, thought he was made of glass, and insisted no one touch him for fear of shattering. You can imagine this made romantic relationships difficult. Still, even Charles had mistresses, though how exactly those relationships functioned is a question best left unanswered. It does suggest that the role of mistress was less about romance and more about the machinery of monarchy. We could go on endlessly, drifting from one royal bedchamber to another, and we will. But the point for now is that kings had mistresses because they could, because the system allowed it, because queens couldn't stop it, because nobles encouraged it, and because, frankly, life in a drafty medieval castle was boring. Tournaments happened only so often. Hunting took a lot of effort, and sometimes the only thing left to do after dinner was find someone who wasn't your wife. And with that thought, let's let our minds wander gently toward the next figure in the sleepy parade of royal entanglements. But before we drift on, tell me, if you had been a medieval queen or king, would you have tolerated this sort of arrangement, or would you have been more like Eleanor of Aquitaine, sharpening a dagger in the corner? Let me know in the comments. So, let's float gently from Henry II and Edward III into the next round of royal men who believed their private lives were either a diplomatic strategy or a hobby. Because if there's one thing medieval kings never quite managed, it was a concept of fidelity. They were crowned, they were anointed with holy oil, they were told they were chosen by God, and then they immediately went sniffing around for someone who wasn't their wife. You'd think divine responsibility would be enough to keep a man busy, but apparently there was always time for one more mistress. Take Charles II of England, for example. He's technically later than the medieval label, but he inherited centuries of tradition. Charles was known as a merry monarch, and merry in this case meant hopelessly addicted to mistresses. He had dozens, official ones, unofficial ones, the occasional actress who wandered too close to the stage. His court was basically one long soap opera, where the only plotline was Charles has fallen in love again. Parliament hated it. The Queen endured it, and Charles himself never apologized for it. He once said he didn't believe God would damn a man for taking a little pleasure along the way, which sounds charming until you realize a little pleasure meant entire dynastic headaches that lasted for generations. But let's not skip ahead too fast. Before Charles and his wigs, there was Charles IV of France, one of the last of the Capetians. He was called Charles the Fair, though portraits suggest the fair might have been wishful thinking. He was married 3 times, and yet his mistresses caused more scandal than his queens. One of his wives was implicated in the infamous Tour de Nesle affair, where French princesses were accused of having affairs with knights. Whether it was true or just malicious gossip, the damage was done, and in a world where queens were judged almost entirely by their ability to be obedient and pure, a whiff of scandal could unravel an entire dynasty. Mistresses weren't always just distractions. Sometimes they were weapons, with rumors about them cutting deeper than swords. And then we have the Avignon popes, who weren't technically kings, but behaved like them. While officially bound by vows of celibacy, many of these holy men kept mistresses quite openly. Clement VI, for instance, was notorious for his lavish court and numerous affairs. His mistresses were treated like queens, and no one seemed terribly shocked, because hypocrisy was practically a sacrament in the 14th century. You could preach chastity in the morning, bless a crusade in the afternoon, and spend the evening whispering sweet nothings to your mistress, all without breaking your stride. But perhaps the most telling stories come from the courts where mistresses weren't merely tolerated but practically celebrated. Take John II of France, known as John the Good. And by the good, chroniclers meant the kind of good that loses battles. He was captured by the English during the 100 Years' War and spent years as a prisoner. You might expect his love life to have cooled under those circumstances. But no, John maintained mistresses, even in captivity. Because apparently, when you're a king, captivity doesn't mean quite the same thing it does for everyone else. He had servants, fine clothes, and yes, companionship. The irony is hard to ignore. The queens of these men were rarely consulted, rarely considered. They were there to produce heirs and maybe embroider something tasteful. Meanwhile, the king's mistresses became celebrities. Chroniclers described their gowns, their jewels, their influence. Queens were dutiful, while mistresses were radiant. It was as if the entire medieval imagination preferred the illicit sparkle of a mistress to the dull respectability of a queen. And yet, not every mistress was remembered fondly. Some became scapegoats. When a king failed, when wars went badly, when taxes rose, people often blamed the woman leading him astray. It was a convenient explanation. After all, it was easier to blame a mistress than admit that maybe the king himself was just incompetent. One wonders how many royal failures were quietly pinned on women who had very little to do with politics beyond suggesting which doublet looked less ridiculous. Edward IV of England is another example worth floating toward. Tall, handsome, and very fond of women, Edward was notorious for his affairs. He married Elizabeth Woodville, a widow of modest background, in what was considered a scandalous love match. But that didn't stop him from keeping mistresses. One of them, Jane Shore, became famous for her beauty and wit. Jane wasn't from the nobility. She was the daughter of a wealthy merchant, which already made her unusual. What really set her apart was her charm. Chroniclers noted that she wasn't just beautiful. She was clever, kind, and actually pleasant to be around. Imagine that, in a court full of grim-faced nobles. After Edward's death, poor Jane was accused of witchcraft by Richard III, because of course she was. Any woman who held a king's attention must have been using sorcery. It's interesting how mistresses often became more vividly remembered than queens. Elizabeth Woodville, for all her political maneuvering, is remembered as stern and ambitious. Jane Shore, who held no official role at all, is remembered as radiant. That imbalance tells you something about how medieval minds worked. Queens were supposed to be distant symbols. Mistresses were allowed to be human. Let's drift for a moment to the Iberian kingdoms. In Castile and Aragon, kings followed the same traditions. Enrique IV Castile, sometimes cruelly nicknamed the Impotent, was rumored to be unable to father children. Whether true or not, his queen's daughter was declared illegitimate, sparking endless dynastic squabbles. But Enrique himself was said to have no shortage of mistresses, which raises awkward questions about how exactly he earned that nickname. One suspects it had less to do with biology and more to do with politics. Calling a king impotent was a handy way to discredit him, especially if he had a reputation for favoring women outside the marriage bed. And then we have Pedro Castile, called the Cruel, though his supporters insisted he was actually the Just. He filled his court with mistresses, the most famous being Maria de Padilla. Unlike many, Maria wasn't discarded when the novelty wore off. Pedro truly loved her by all accounts. He even insisted she was his lawful wife after her death, despite having married other women for politics in the meantime. It's a classic royal contradiction. Publicly, he followed the script of dynastic marriage. Privately, he clung to the woman he actually loved, which is almost touching until you remember he was also busy murdering rivals left and right. This brings us back to a theme worth noting. Mistresses could be pawns, but sometimes they were genuine loves. It's easy to dismiss them all as political accessories, but here and there you find kings who truly adored these women. Henry II with Rosamund, Edward IV with Jane Shore, Pedro with Maria de Padilla. In their letters, their gifts, their willingness to bend rules, you catch glimpses of something more than convenience. But of course, even genuine affection couldn't stop the larger machinery of politics. Mistresses who became too influential were often destroyed by jealous courtiers or suspicious queens. So why so many mistresses? The answers are stacking up: boredom, politics, tradition, and occasionally actual affection, but also a culture that rewarded kings for excess. Having mistresses was a sign of virility, of strength, of dominance. It proved you were powerful enough to break rules and get away with it. To have no mistresses might have been seen as weakness, which is rather sad when you think about it. Imagine being judged not for how you ruled, but for how many women you could keep in your orbit without collapsing the court in scandal. And as we drift toward our next collection of tangled royal romances, let's pause for a sleepy thought. If you were a noble at court, would you have risked offering your daughter as a royal mistress, hoping for favor, or would you have kept her far away, knowing the dangers? It's a difficult question, and one I'd love to hear your thoughts on in the comments below. By now, it should be fairly clear that mistresses were not an occasional hobby, but almost a standard accessory for medieval kings. Like a crown or a particularly itchy velvet robe, they came with the job. What's interesting is not just that kings had them, but how everyone around them reacted. The nobility, the clergy, the people, and, of course, the queens, who had the most unenviable role in the entire business. They were supposed to smile politely, produce airs, and say nothing while their husbands paraded lovers in front of the entire court. Let's drift first to France again, because the French court seems to have perfected the art of mistress management long before anyone else. Louis XI, sometimes called the universal spider for his web of intrigue, had a number of affairs. Unlike some of his more flamboyant successors, Louis kept his women mostly in the shadows. His mother, however, was keenly aware of them, because mothers always know, and Louis, for all his plotting and scheming, was just one more royal man who believed that mistresses were part of his royal entitlement. His queen could only sit in silence, watching him weave his little spiderweb both in politics and in the bedroom. His descendant, Francis I, would make the whole mistress tradition almost official. He adored women, and he didn't bother to hide it. His court became famous for its gallantry, which is a polite way of saying everyone was flirting with everyone, and the king was leading the charge. Francis liked to claim he was every lady's knight, and in a sense he wrote poetry, he danced, he dallied. His queen, Claude of France, spent much of her short life pregnant, while Francis spent much of his wandering in search of more amusement. Yet somehow, chroniclers described him as charming, because apparently, if you wore enough silk and quoted enough verses, people forgave you for ignoring your wife. But France wasn't alone. Let's drift to Scotland for a moment, where James IV carried on with several mistresses, producing a small army of illegitimate children. Strangely enough, those children were often acknowledged and given good marriages, which meant that the Scottish nobility was filled with half-royal cousins. It must have made family gatherings very complicated. Imagine the feast hall. One table for the legitimate heirs, another for the acknowledged bastards, and a third for whichever mistress happened to be in favor that month. James's queen, Margaret Tudor, sister Henry VIII, had little choice but to accept it. After all, her own brother was soon to become the poster child for royal infidelity. Henry VIII is, of course, impossible to ignore. He turned the whole idea of royal mistresses into something like a state sport. While technically Renaissance rather than medieval, Henry carried forward all the medieval traditions of boredom, excess, and entitlement, only with more drama. His mistresses included Elizabeth Blunt, with whom he had a son, and Mary Bullen, sister of the more famous Anne. Henry never really bothered to hide these affairs, partly because he didn't think he needed to. He was king, after all, and if he wanted to parade a mistress through court, who was going to stop him? Not the Pope, not Parliament, and certainly not his long-suffering wives. What's ironic about Henry is that for all his chasing after mistresses, what he really wanted was a legitimate son. He was obsessed with securing the dynasty. So he spent decades shuffling wives and entertaining mistresses, but the result was mostly daughters and disappointment. His mistresses may have amused him, but they didn't solve his fundamental problem. You can almost picture Henry frowning at his mistresses as if it were their fault his children weren't the right gender. Because naturally, in the 16th century, science hadn't yet clarified that men determined that outcome. It was always a woman's fault, of course. Convenient, if inaccurate. But Henry wasn't alone in that frustration. Across Europe, kings often turned to mistresses because their queens failed, through no fault of their own, to provide heirs. In those moments, mistresses became more than diversions. They became proof that the king was still capable. If the queen failed to conceive, the mistress could be offered as evidence. Look, the king has fathered a healthy child. The problem must lie with the queen. This was especially convenient for monarchs who wanted to replace their wives anyway. A mistress's child could serve as leverage, as justification, or as scandal, depending on how the king chose to spin it. And sometimes, mistresses weren't just tolerated. They were integrated into court life. Some queens quietly befriended them, not out of affection, but out of pragmatism. After all, it was safer to keep your husband's mistress on your side than risk open hostility. Queens who played the long game sometimes used mistresses as allies, feeding them information or gifts in return for influence over king. It's a strange triangular relationship, part rivalry, part partnership. History tends to paint queens as tragic figures in this arrangement, but in reality, some of them were shrewd enough to use it to their advantage. Let's not forget Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France in the 16th century. Her husband, Henry II, was utterly devoted to his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, who was 20 years older than him. Catherine, married off at 14, spent decades in her rival's shadow. And yet, Catherine played the long game. She endured, she waited, and when Henry finally died in a jousting accident, she stepped into full power as regent for her sons. Diane was promptly banished from court. Catherine had suffered humiliation in silence for years, but she didn't forget. When the time came, she reminded everyone that queens, however sidelined, could still outlast mistresses. It's worth pausing here to notice how mistresses often dictated the cultural mood of a court. Under Catherine and Diane, the French court was steeped in refinement, elegance, and endless rivalry between the two women. Under Charles II of England, it became a playground for actresses and scandals. Under Henry VIII, it turned into a grim parade of discarded wives and nervous courtiers. Mistresses weren't just individuals. They set the tone, sometimes the fashion, and often the political gossip that shaped entire eras. The church, of course, frowned upon all of this. Officially, kings were supposed to set an example of Christian morality. In practice, priests looked the other way. A king was too dangerous to scold, and besides, monasteries like royal donations. Better to preach abstinence in general terms than to lecture the man who could seize your lands. Every so often, a particularly bold preacher would rail against a king's lifestyle. But usually, the worst that happened was a few stern letters, which were promptly ignored. Kings didn't take orders in the bedroom, even from the Pope, so the tradition continued generation after generation. Kings kept mistresses because their fathers had, because it was expected, because it was convenient, and because very few people could stop them. Queens endured, nobles schemed, and commoners whispered gossip that brightened their otherwise monotonous lives. After all, what could be more entertaining than hearing that the man who claimed divine authority spent his nights sneaking through corridors like a lovesick teenager? And as we drift onward into more examples of royal excess, let's leave ourselves with one soft question. If you had been a medieval queen, would you have played along quietly, using mistresses to your advantage like Catherine de' Medici, or would you have taken Eleanor of Aquitaine's sharper approach? I'd love to know which path you'd choose, so share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's drift now into the later medieval and early Renaissance world, where royal mistresses weren't just lovers in the shadows, but became threads woven into dynastic politics. By this point, everyone more or less expected kings to have them. The real question wasn't if a king had a mistress, but which one was in favor this month, and how much power she had managed to collect while the queen smiled politely in the background. One of the most telling examples is Charles VII of France, who reigned during the tail end of the 100 Years' War. Charles is often remembered as a king rescued by Joan of Arc, which is a dramatic enough legacy on its own, but his private life added its own peculiar chapter. His most famous mistress was Agnes Sorel, often called the first officially recognized royal mistress of France. She was strikingly beautiful, again, as beautiful as medieval chroniclers ever allowed women to be, and more importantly, she was influential. Agnes encouraged Charles to focus on reclaiming France from the English, which is a fairly impressive contribution for someone technically outside the official power structure. Agnes's presence at court scandalized many, not least because she was given land, jewels, and a place of honor that eclipsed even the queen's. She was paraded openly, a new development in royal mistressing. Instead of hiding in the background, Agnes sat in the spotlight, glowing with pearls and silks while courtiers whispered behind their hands. The Queen Marie of Anjou endured it with quiet dignity, as queens so often had to. But Agnes was different. She wasn't just tolerated, she was celebrated, painted by artists and immortalized in legend. Of course, she died young, probably from dysentery, though whispers claim poison. Convenient, isn't it, how mistresses who became too prominent often died suspiciously. Charles VII wasn't unique. His son, Louis XI, took a more shadowy approach, preferring secrecy to pageantry. But the pattern was clear. French kings were slowly formalizing the role of mistress, turning it from scandal into tradition. By the 16th century, it was expected. The French court even coined terms to differentiate between the official mistress and all the unofficial extras who hovered at the edges. It was a system with job descriptions, in its own bizarre way. Across the Channel, England was equally busy with its own entanglements. Let's drift back for a moment to Henry II's descendants. By the time we reach Richard II, the picture is complicated. Richard married in a Bohemia, a political alliance. They were childless, and while Richard had favorites among his courtiers, male favorites, which raised his own kind of gossip, he didn't leave behind a parade of acknowledged mistresses. Some kings, interestingly, leaned less on women and more on intimate male companions. The court still whispered, of course, because gossip never missed a chance. But Richard's example shows that not every king followed the pattern so neatly. Some chose favoritism of another sort entirely, which scandalized the nobility in equal measure. And then there was Henry V, England's warrior king, the one immortalized by Shakespeare as a paragon of noble leadership. Henry's personal life was surprisingly restrained, at least in surviving records. He married Catherine of Valois, secured the throne of France for himself, and then promptly died young, leaving behind a single son. No endless list of mistresses, no dramatic scandals, just a brief, intense reign and then silence. His queen, left widowed, caused her own drama later by marrying Owen Tudor, a Welsh courtier. That little love story, considered scandalous at the time, would eventually spawn the Tudor dynasty. So perhaps in Henry's case, the lack of mistresses created fewer stories. But his widow's choices more than made up for it. Still, Henry V was the exception, not the rule. His son, Henry VI, was fragile, pious, and often incapacitated by mental illness. Mistresses don't figure much in his life either. Instead, the Wars of the Roses tore England apart, with queens and nobles playing the leading roles. But once Edward IV came to power, mistresses came roaring back into the picture, especially Jane Shore. As we drifted over earlier, Edward IV treated his mistresses as trophies. He enjoyed them, showed them off, and wasn't shy about acknowledging them. Jane Shore's legacy outshone that of many queens, which tells you everything about where royal attention really lay. Meanwhile, over in Spain, things were equally complicated. Ferdinand of Aragon, husband of Isabella, is remembered for uniting Spain and launching voyages that accidentally discovered America. His marriage was famously strong, a true partnership in many respects. But Ferdinand still found time for mistresses. He fathered illegitimate children, though his bond with Isabella was strong enough that history tends to sweep those dalliances under the rug. It's remarkable how some kings' infidelities were painted as charming footnotes, while others became central scandals. It usually depended less on the number of mistresses, and more on how much the queen or court tolerated them. Portugal had its share as well. King John V in the 18th century would later become notorious for keeping entire convents supplied with mistresses, but even earlier rulers dabbled as much as their neighbors. The Iberian courts were not immune to the lure of unofficial companions, no matter how pious they liked to appear on holy days. What's striking is how often mistresses became scapegoats for dynastic misfortunes. If a kingdom faced famine or a war went poorly, or the treasury emptied faster than expected, fingers often pointed at the mistress. She was bleeding the king dry, whispering bad advice, bewitching him with her charms. It was far easier to blame a single woman than to admit that perhaps the king's military campaign was just badly planned. Mistresses became convenient lightning rods, absorbing the resentment of the people while kings shrugged and carried on. This pattern would continue into the Renaissance and beyond, but its roots were firmly medieval. From Rosamund Clifford's supposed labyrinth, to Agnes Sorrel's pearl-studded gowns, to Jane Shore's charm, mistresses were simultaneously adored and condemned. They were glamorized in poetry, vilified in sermons, whispered about in taverns, and immortalized in chronicles. They were never invisible, even if queens had to pretend not to notice them standing 3 feet away. And as we settle softly at the close of this part, let's leave with one gentle question. If you were a medieval chronicler, writing the official record, would you have praised the king's mistress as radiant and charming, or condemned her as greedy and manipulative? After all, your choice might have determined whether you kept your head. Share your sleepy thoughts in the comments below. The medieval world was already comfortable with royal mistresses, but the Renaissance turned them into something grander. They became celebrities, symbols, even quasi-political actors. The courts of Europe were glittering theaters, and mistresses played their roles with a mixture of charm, danger, and sheer survival instinct. Let's begin in England, with a dynasty that remains endlessly fascinating. The Tudors. Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor line, kept his nose fairly clean. He was cautious, practical, and focused on securing his fragile throne after the Wars of the Roses. History doesn't give us a list of his mistresses, though whispers likely floated about. His marriage to Elizabeth of York was politically vital, uniting rival houses. Henry VII was not the flamboyant sort. His son, however, was an entirely different matter. Enter Henry VIII. Even if you drifted through every history lesson half asleep, you probably remember this king. He is remembered for his 6 wives, each with her own grim little rhyme. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But Henry's official wives were only part of the story. His mistresses filled the spaces between, and sometimes directly influenced who would end up queen. One of the most famous was Elizabeth Blount, known as Bessie. She was young, pretty, and caught Henry's wandering eye early in his reign. Their relationship produced a son, Henry Fitzroy, whom the king acknowledged openly. That was unusual. Illegitimate children often hovered on the margins, but Henry gave Fitzroy titles and status. Some even speculated he might name the boy heir, especially when legitimate sons failed to arrive. Then came Mary Boleyn, sister of the more famous Anne. Mary was Henry's mistress for a time, though exactly when and for how long is debated. Some rumors claim 2 of her children may have been his, though historians remain divided. Either way, Mary's dalliance paved the way for Anne's rise, which of course led to one of the most dramatic marital breakdowns in history. And Boleyn began as a courtier, witty and sharp. She refused to be a mistress in the traditional sense, insisting Henry make her queen if he wanted her fully. And so he did, breaking from Rome, launching the English Reformation, and rewriting the very structure of church and state. It's a startling example of how the line between mistress and queen could blur, especially in an era where royal desire could topple empires. Henry's other liaisons included Jane Seymour, before she became queen, and countless unnamed women. By the later years of his reign, his health declined, and the stories grow quieter. But his younger days show the raw power of mistresses, both fleeting and enduring. Across the Channel, the French court had been developing its own traditions. By the 16th century, mistresses weren't merely companions. They were the maîtresse en titre, the official, recognized favorite. Francis I, the great Renaissance king of France, embodied this perfectly. Francis adored women. His court glittered with them. He patronized art, literature, and architecture, but he also devoted enormous energy to his mistresses. They were celebrated openly, given titles and estates, woven into the fabric of court life. The difference between France and England at this time was visibility. While England still treated mistresses as semi-scandalous, France embraced them as part of the royal spectacle. One of Francis's most famous mistresses was Françoise de Foix. She held influence for years, balancing her role carefully. Later came an Epicelou, witty and cultured, who dominated Francis's later court. These women weren't hidden. They were central. They shaped culture, art, even politics through their proximity to the king. Mistresses became patrons themselves, commissioning works, influencing style and setting trends. If the queen represented duty, the mistress represented glamour. Courtiers often gravitated toward them, hoping for favor. A word from the king's mistress could secure advancement or ensure ruin. This set the tone for later centuries. The French would become synonymous with powerful, official royal mistresses. England, meanwhile, would follow its own path, especially once Elizabeth I came to the throne. Elizabeth famously avoided marriage altogether, styling herself the Virgin Queen. She had favorites, certainly Robert Dudley most of all, but she refused to play the role of wife or mistress. Instead, she turned the court's expectations upside down, wielding flirtation as a political tool without surrendering her independence. In her own way, Elizabeth weaponized the mistress dynamic, keeping her male courtiers dancing in perpetual hope. Elsewhere in Europe, the pattern repeated. In the Habsburg courts in Spain, in smaller German principalities, kings and princes gathered mistresses the way they collected tapestries. Some were brief flings, forgotten almost immediately. Others left legacies that stretched across decades. And what of the queens? Many bored in silence, presenting the proper public face while knowing full well what went on behind palace walls. A few fought back, creating scandals of their own. Some found lovers in return, though female infidelity carried far more danger. A king's mistress might be tolerated, even admired. A queen's affair could end in imprisonment, divorce, or worse. The double standard was as rigid as stone. By the Renaissance, mistresses had become symbols of power and refinement, but also of unease. Pamphlets mocked them, preachers condemned them, and yet they thrived. They embodied a strange contradiction, both glamorous and dangerous, both adored and despised. Kings rarely cared about the whispers. For them, mistresses were simply part of the crown's privileges, as natural as hunting or feasting. And as you drift at the close of this chapter, let me leave you with a gentle thought. If you lived at the Tudor or French court, would you have dared to pursue the role of mistress, with its jewels and influence, knowing it could also bring jealousy, poison, and sudden downfall? Whisper your answer softly in the comments before sleep carries you away. After Montespan came Madame de Maintenon, who played a subtler role, more pious and restrained. She eventually married Louis in a secret, morganatic ceremony. She was technically his wife, though never queen. Maintenon shaped his later reign, encouraging religious devotion and more sober living. The contrast between Montespan and Maintenon shows how mistresses could define eras, one flamboyant and glittering, the other somber and devout. The French model of the maîtresse en titre spread across Europe. In England, Charles II cultivated his own version of the system. Known as a merry monarch, Charles had a dazzling array of mistresses, from noble women to actresses. Barbara Villiers, Duchess of Cleveland, was bold, imperious, and extravagantly maintained. Nell Gwynn, the actress, was beloved for her wit and common touch. The king kept multiple mistresses simultaneously, showering them with titles and wealth, and acknowledging their children openly. The English court under Charles was almost French in its acceptance of mistresses as public figures. It was less scandalous and more expected, a kind of performance of royal virility. The queen, Catherine of Braganza, bore it quietly, though childless and sidelined. Meanwhile, the mistresses flourished, their names still remembered centuries later. Elsewhere, the Habsburgs maintained a stricter facade, but mistresses existed there too, hidden behind layers of protocol. In Spain, Philip IV fathered a multitude of illegitimate children, though the dour atmosphere of Madrid made his liaisons less glittering than their French counterparts. Still, even in these restrained courts, mistresses shaped dynasties from the shadows. One can almost sense the peculiar balance at play. Queens offer legitimacy, treaties, and heirs. Mistresses offered passion, companionship, and sometimes clever political advice. Together they formed a strange dual monarchy, with one woman crowned and the other uncrowned, yet both vital to the king's reign. And always the risks loomed. A mistress might fall victim to jealousy, to rumors of witchcraft, to sudden illness, or simply to the king's wandering eye. Few retired peacefully. Most watched their influence fade as new favorites emerged, younger and more alluring. It was a cruel game of survival, one that queens rarely had to play, but mistresses endured constantly. As we drift onward, think about the spectacle of Versailles, where gilded halls echo with whispers of who held the king's attention that week. Imagine the courtiers scurrying, adjusting their loyalties, hedging their bets. Would you have dared to tie your fortunes to such a precarious star? Tell me softly in the comments whether you'd chase the glitter or keep to the safety of the shadows. By the 18th century, the mistress had become something like a permanent institution. Versailles glittered with them, London tolerated them, and across Europe courtiers learned about not only the kings but also to the women who captured their affections. If the Middle Ages had kept mistresses in the shadows, and the Renaissance had elevated them into quasi-public roles, the 18th century made them cultural icons. They appeared in portraits, in gossip sheets, and in whispers at salons. Let's return to France, because it is almost impossible not to. Louis XV carried on the tradition of his great-grandfather, the Sun King, but with his own peculiar twist. Unlike Louis XIV, who kept only a few dominant favorites, Louis XV seemed almost unable to stop himself. He had mistresses of every type, noble women, actresses, even entire households of carefully selected girls. Where his great-grandfather's relationships had shaped culture, his often blurred into scandal. The most famous of his favorites was Madame de Pompadour. Jean Antoinette Poussin, an ordinary woman with an extraordinary talent for charm, rose from middle-class beginnings to become the maitresse in titre. Pompadour was witty, cultured, and clever. She wasn't simply beautiful. She was strategic. She aligned herself with the arts, with philosophy, with architecture. Under her influence, the Rococo style flourished, all curves and pastels and powdered elegance. Pompadour's enemies were legion. Courtiers resented her influence. The queen endured her presence in silence. Pamphleteers mocked her relentlessly. Yet she held power for nearly 20 years, long after her romantic relationship with Louis had cooled. She became, in effect, his best friend and advisor, shaping policies and tastes alike. It is telling that when she died, the king mourned deeply, whispering that he would never replace her. Of course, he did replace her with others. But Pompadour's reign as mistress showed that these women could be far more than bedwarmers. They were political actors, cultural leaders, and, in some ways, the true rulers of taste. Later came Madame du Barry, a very different figure. Where Pompadour was refined, du Barry was flamboyant. She had risen from humble beginnings and never quite shed her accent or her air of vulgarity, at least in the eyes of the aristocracy. Yet Louis adored her. Courtiers were forced to acknowledge her, even as they sneered. She became a symbol of decadence, of the court's disconnection from reality, and her downfall was brutal. When the revolution came, du Barry was arrested and executed, her pleas for mercy echoing in vain. The revolution despised not only kings, but also the glittering mistresses who had embodied monarchical excess. Meanwhile, in England, mistresses had a slightly different flavor. The Hanoverian kings were hardly paragons of romance, but they had their share favorites. George I and George II both had mistresses, though their German origins and dour personalities made the liaisons less glamorous than those of the French court. By the time of George III, things had grown even quieter. George was famously devoted to his wife, Charlotte, in what was almost a shocking display of fidelity for time. The English system of mistresses never quite reached the same cultural heights as the French, though actresses, courtesans, and companions still hovered around the fringes of court life. Elsewhere in Europe, the same story repeated with local variations. In Russia, Catherine the Great flipped the script entirely, keeping lovers of her own. She was no fool. She selected them carefully, often promoting them to positions of influence before quietly retiring them with estates once the relationship ended. The double standard that punished queens for infidelity crumbled in her hands. Catherine, as an empress ruling in her own right, had no need to hide behind propriety. Her lovers were part of her image, evidence of her vitality and independence. It scandalized European courts, but also fascinated them. In smaller German states, Italian principalities, and Austrian courts, mistresses remained fixtures. They were not always as glittering as Pompadour or as tragic as Du Barry, but they were there, quietly shaping dynasties. Some bore illegitimate children who would later marry into nobility, blurring bloodlines. Others used their influence to promote relatives, ensuring their families rose with them. A mistress was rarely alone. She was often the spearhead of a clan, dragging siblings and cousins up into prominence. As the 18th century rolled on, satire grew sharper. Writers mocked kings for their endless affairs. Caricatures of mistresses circulated widely. Public opinion began to sour, seeing them not as glamorous companions, but as parasites draining the state. The seeds of revolution were sown, not only in tax policy and famine, but also in the spectacle of kings draped in powdered mistresses, while their people starved. It is perhaps fitting that when the French Revolution finally erupted, mistresses became one of its prime targets. They represented everything that was frivolous, decadent, and corrupt about monarchy. Queens were condemned, but mistresses were despised outright. The guillotine did not spare them. And so, as the old world crumbled, the mistress went from glittering icon to condemned scapegoat. They had shaped art, politics, and dynasties, but they could not survive the wrath of a people tired of powdered wigs and gilded halls. As you drift now, imagine yourself in a Rococo salon, light flickering off painted walls, the air heavy with perfume and whispers. Would you have sided with Pompadour, clever and refined, or Du Barry, bold and unapologetic? Tell me softly in the comments which fate you think you would have met, survival through charm or downfall through scandal. Elsewhere in Europe, the same story repeated with local variations. In Russia, Catherine the Great flipped the script entirely, keeping lovers of her own. She was no fool. She selected them carefully, often promoting them to positions of influence before quietly retiring them with estates once the relationship ended. The double standard that punished queens for infidelity crumbled in her hands. Catherine, as an empress ruling in her own right, had no need to hide behind propriety. Her lovers were part of her image, evidence of her vitality and independence. It scandalized European courts, but also fascinated them. In smaller German states, Italian principalities, and Austrian courts, mistresses remained fixtures. They were not always as glittering as Pompadour or as tragic as Du Barry, but they were there, quietly shaping dynasties. Some bore illegitimate children who would later marry into nobility, blurring bloodlines. Others used their influence to promote relatives, ensuring their families rose with them. A mistress was rarely alone. She was often the spearhead of a clan, dragging siblings and cousins up into prominence. As the 18th century rolled on, satire grew sharper. Writers mocked kings for their endless affairs. Caricatures of mistresses circulated widely. Public opinion began to sour, seeing them not as glamorous companions, but as parasites draining the state. The seeds of revolution were sown, not only in tax policy and famine, but also in the spectacle of kings draped in powdered mistresses, while their people starved. It is perhaps fitting that when the French Revolution finally erupted, mistresses became one of its prime targets. They represented everything that was frivolous, decadent, and corrupt about monarchy. Queens were condemned, but mistresses were despised outright. The guillotine did not spare them. And so, as the old world crumbled, the mistress went from glittering icon to condemned scapegoat. They had shaped art, politics, and dynasties, but they could not survive the wrath of a people tired of powdered wigs and gilded halls. As you drift now, imagine yourself in a Rococo salon, light flickering off painted walls, the air heavy with perfume and whispers. Would you have sided with Pompadour, clever and refined, or do Barry, bold and unapologetic? Tell me softly in the comments which fate you think you would have met, survival through charm or downfall through scandal. The French Revolution had toppled kings and queens, swept away the powdered salons, and sent mistresses to the guillotine. For a brief moment, it looked as though the age of royal mistresses was gone forever. But of course, human habits are stubborn things. Kings may lose their heads, but their desires rarely change. By the turn of the 19th century, the world was reshaping itself under new empires, new courts, and new scandals, and mistresses returned, though in slightly different clothing. Let's begin with Napoleon Bonaparte. He was not a king in the traditional sense, though he crowned himself emperor with a flourish that made kings look almost modest. Napoleon was famously ambitious, famously restless, and naturally, famously unfaithful. His first wife, Josephine, captured his heart early on. Their letters from his campaigns drip with passion, or at least Napoleon's passion. He once wrote her a plea not to bathe before he returned, which may not be the most romantic line ever penned, but it certainly shows his intensity. But while Napoleon adored Josephine, he also betrayed her constantly. Mistresses followed him wherever he went, from Italian campaigns to Parisian salons. Some were noble women, others were courtesans. Napoleon treated them casually, with the air of a man who considered fidelity an inconvenient concept. Josephine, in turn, was hardly faithful herself. Their marriage was stormy, full of fiery letters, reconciliations, and cold silences. Eventually, Napoleon set her aside because she could not produce an heir. It was not love that ended their marriage, but politics. He needed a dynasty, and Josephine could not provide it. His second wife, Marie-Louise of Austria, gave him a son, but his mistresses remained. Even at the height of empire, in glittering palaces or dusty military tents, they hovered close. After Napoleon fell, Europe reshuffled itself into monarchies once more. The Congress of Vienna restored kings, queens, and, inevitably, mistresses. But something had changed. The 19th century was an age of newspapers, caricatures, and growing public scrutiny. Mistresses were no longer simply whispered about in corridors. They were written about in pamphlets and sketched in satirical journals. Their influence became harder to hide, and their scandals traveled faster. In France, the restored Bourbons carried on the old tradition. Louis XVIII and Charles X were elderly and less flamboyant. But Louis Philippe, who followed, tolerated the same kinds of private arrangements. The real spectacle came with Napoleon III, nephew of the great emperor, who ruled the Second Empire. He was endlessly unfaithful to his wife, Eugenie, charming a parade of women with the practiced ease of man who viewed mistresses as part of his imperial toolkit. Paris, under his reign, was once again a city of salons, gossip, and scandal. England, meanwhile, was adjusting to its own royal eccentricities. George IV, the first gentleman of Europe, was anything but gentle. He was extravagant, gluttonous, and perpetually entangled with mistresses. His marriage to Caroline of Brunswick was a disaster from the start. The two despised each other. George filled his life with lovers, most notably Maria Fitzherbert, with whom he went through a secret marriage ceremony that was not legally binding. For decades, Maria hovered between the roles of mistress and wife, adored by some, dismissed by others. The Victorian era brought a surprising shift. Queen Victoria herself was famously devoted to her husband, Prince Albert, and their 9 children. The spectacle of royal mistresses seemed almost to vanish from Britain, at least in the official sense. But even Victoria's children and successors would stray back into the old traditions. Edward VII, her son, was notorious for his mistresses. He had numerous affairs with actresses, aristocrats, and courtesans, earning him a reputation as a playboy Prince long before he ascended the throne. His most famous mistress, Alice Keppel, remained by his side for years, managing his moods and smoothing over his indiscretions. She became almost an unofficial consort, quietly accepted, even respected by many. Interestingly, Alice Keppel's great-granddaughter would later become Camilla Parker Bowles' mistress and eventually wife of Charles, Prince of Wales. History, it seems, has a sense of irony. Across Europe, the pattern continued. In Austria, Franz Joseph I ruled for decades with Empress Elizabeth Cece at his side. Their marriage was complicated, marked by tragedy and distance. Franz Joseph consoled himself with mistresses, while Elizabeth sought escape in endless travels and melancholic poetry. In Russia, Alexander II openly kept a mistress, Catherine Dolgorukova, whom he eventually married morganatically after his wife's death. Their children were acknowledged, though excluded from succession. By the late 19th century, mistresses were both more visible and more precarious. They could not be erased from public knowledge, but they were increasingly criticized. The rise of bourgeois morality, fueled by Victorian values and public press, made them seem less glamorous than before. To many, they were symbols of aristocratic decadence in an age that was beginning to value restraint, propriety, and public virtue, at least on the surface. And yet, kings continued as they always had. They may have read newspapers with mild irritation, but they rarely abandoned their habits. Mistresses remained fixtures in palaces, salons, and theaters. They were still patrons of art and literature, still figures of fascination. The only difference was that now the world watched them more closely, noting every pearl necklace and carriage ride. As we drift near the close of this part, imagine yourself in a 19th century salon, velvet drapes heavy around you, the air clouded with cigar smoke and gossip. Would you have risked becoming a royal mistress in an age of newspapers and caricatures, when your face might be sketched and mocked across Europe? Or would you prefer the shadows of an earlier century, where secrets stayed within palace walls? Let me know softly in the comments which world you would have chosen. By the end of the 19th century, kings and emperors ruled vast empires, but their thrones sat on trembling foundations. Revolutions, industrial unrest, and rising democracy gnawed at royal authority. And yet, even as crowns grew shakier, the private habits of kings did not change. Mistresses remained, though now they had to coexist with an increasingly judgmental public and a press hungry for scandal. Take Edward VII of Britain, who had spent his decades as Prince of Wales cultivating the art of pleasure. He loved Parisian nightlife, horse racing, and women, always women. By the time he became king in 1901, he was 60 years old, overweight, and chronically indulgent, but his mistresses still defined his private world. Alice Keppel, his longtime companion, was more than a lover. She was a confidant, a calming influence, and a skilled courtier. It was said she could soothe the king's temper better than his ministers ever could. She attended official events discreetly, managed gossip with charm, and remained by his side until his death in 1910. Alice's presence was no secret. The Edwardian elite tolerated her, even relied on her, in a way that would have scandalized earlier Victorians. She set a template for the 20th century's official mistress, less a hidden shadow, more a tolerated partner in the royal household. Yet her very visibility showed how much times had changed. Newspapers hinted, satirists joked, and the public half smiled, half judged. Across Europe, other monarchs followed similar paths. Leopold II of Belgium, for example, ruled not only a kingdom but also the vast, brutal Congo Free State. His public image was one of philanthropy and paternal authority, but in private he lived with Caroline Lacroix, a mistress 40 years his junior. He showered her with wealth, titles, and estates, causing enormous scandal. To his critics, Caroline became a symbol of his greed and hypocrisy. When he died in 1909, he left her a fortune, but Belgium's government quickly seized much of it, determined not to let his mistress profit too richly from his reign. In Russia, the twilight of the Romanovs was heavy with whispers of mysticism, scandal, and distrust. Tsar Nicholas II was, by most accounts, faithful to his wife, Alexandra. But fidelity did not spare the dynasty from gossip. Instead of mistresses, it was Alexander's reliance on Rasputin, the strange bearded mystic. that fueled rumor. Many whispered that Alexander's closeness to him was improper, though evidence suggests it was spiritual desperation rather than romance. Still, the line between scandalous mistress and scandalous advisor blurred in the public imagination. To a restless empire, it made little difference. Either way, the royal bedchamber seemed compromised. Elsewhere, the pattern of indulgence continued. In Spain, Alfonso XIII carried on the long Bourbon tradition of mistresses. He was reckless, often brazen, and fathered illegitimate children. His behavior clashed sharply with the political turbulence of his reign, feeding public disillusionment with the monarchy. In Italy, King Victor Emmanuel III presented a more respectable public image, but even there, royal mistresses hovered at the edges. What is striking about the early 20th century is how mistresses became woven into the story of monarchy's decline. Once, they had symbolized glamour, power, and even patronage of the arts. Now, they often look like decadence, hypocrisy, or distraction in a world that demanded modern leadership. The press amplified every rumor, every liaison, until private indulgence became public weakness. Then came the First World War. Thrones toppled like dominoes. Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire. Where mistresses had once been part of royal life, there was now only exile, revolution, or execution. The glamour dimmed under the weight of war. In Russia, the whispers about Alexander and Rasputin turned deadly. They fueled suspicion that helped push the monarchy toward its bloody end. In Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II's love affairs seemed trivial compared to the scale of national collapse. But even in the ruins of war, the pattern persisted. Edward VIII, who ascended the British throne in 1936, would prove the most dramatic example. His mistress and later wife, Wallis Simpson, was not merely tolerated. She was condemned by governments, churches, and empires. Edward's insistence on marrying her, a twice-divorced American, cost him his crown. For the first time in centuries, a king gave up a throne not for politics, not for war, but for love, or at least for desire. The mistress had finally triumphed over monarchy itself. As you lie here in the quiet, imagine yourself in that strange interwar period, a time when kings were still draped in ceremony but stripped of much of their power. Would you have risked becoming their mistress in such a world, where scandal could bring down not just reputations, but entire dynasties? Or would you have stepped back, letting the age of monarchy fade without your shadow on its history? Tell me gently in the comments which choice your heart would have made. By the middle of the 20th century, monarchy itself had become a curious relic. It remained draped in ermine and ceremony, but the world around it had grown restless. Wars had shattered empires, revolutions had toppled dynasties, and democracy was no longer content to sit quietly in the corner. Yet amid all this upheaval, mistresses endured, though they no longer lived quite so safely in the shadows. In Britain, the abdication crisis of 1936 lingered like a ghost. Edward VIII, who gave up the throne to marry Wallis Simpson, left behind an indelible reminder that love affairs could be more dangerous than armies. His younger brother, George VI, tried to repair the monarchy's image with family devotion and quiet dignity. He succeeded, but the damage was done. For the first time in modern history, the public had seen the crown itself sacrificed on the altar of romance. Mistresses, once half-hidden figures at court, had now been thrust into the very center of national destiny. Elsewhere, Europe's kings continued their habits, though under very different spotlights. King Farouk of Egypt, for example, styled himself as a modern pharaoh, but his reputation was consumed by excess. He collected cars, jewels, and mistresses with equal zeal. His private life became a carnival of gossip, marked by endless affairs, late-night escapades, and extravagant gifts. By the time he was overthrown in 1952, his mistresses had become part of the evidence of his indulgence and incompetence. It was not simply politics that destroyed his reign. It was the image of a monarch who gorged himself on luxuries while his country craved reform. In Greece, King Paul and later King Constantine tried to steer a monarchy in peril. Rumors of mistresses floated around, as they always did, but the times had changed. What might once have been accepted as royal prerogative was now viewed through the lens of democratic resentment. Mistresses no longer lent glamour. They suggested hypocrisy. And then there was Spain. Alfonso XIII had been exiled in 1931. His endless affairs remember more bitterly than fondly. But his grandson, Juan Carlos, would later revive the Bourbon line under Franco's shadow. And once again, Mistresses returned. By the late 20th century, Juan Carlos's relationships beyond marriage were not simply whispered about. They became public knowledge, printed in magazines, dissected on television, and debated by journalists. The mistress had survived into an age of instant headlines. It is here, perhaps, that we see the most striking shift. In the medieval and early modern world, mistresses were almost institutionalized. They existed as part of royal households, serving political, personal, and sometimes artistic purposes. But in the modern democratic age, mistresses became symbols of monarchy's stubborn refusal to modernize. What had once been celebrated as virility or charm now looked like irresponsibility. Still, the personal lives of monarchs never stopped drawing fascination. Consider Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, consort to Queen Juliana. He was charismatic, cosmopolitan, and undeniably unfaithful. His affairs, sometimes with celebrities, sometimes with women of less fame, were open secrets. He embodied a contradiction. A man admired publicly for charm, but privately entangled in scandals that strained the royal household. For the Dutch people, it was a reminder that monarchy, however modern, still carried the same old flaws. In Britain again, the royal family tried to keep pace with changing expectations. Elizabeth II, ascending in 1952, reshaped the monarchy into a spectacle of duty and restraint. But even her reign could not avoid the shadow of mistresses. Her sister, Princess Margaret, was surrounded by rumors, affairs, and heartbreak, and her children, as the decades wore on, revealed that royal marriages were still subject to the same tensions as their ancestors. Charles, Prince of Wales, made this most visible. His long relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles began in the 1970s and never truly ended, even as he married Diana Spencer in 1981. The love triangle dominated British headlines for decades. What would once have been the private indulgence of a royal heir became public agony, televised across the globe. For the first time in history, the entire world shared in the spectacle of a royal mistress, and not with sleepy acceptance, with scrutiny, criticism, and outrage. The irony was sharp. Mistresses had once been accepted as natural, even necessary. By the 20th century, they were condemned, even though they remained just as present. Charles's long relationship with Camilla was no different, in essence, from Edward II's favorites or Henry IV's entanglements. But in an age of cameras, microphones, and tabloids, the role of mistress became unbearable. And yet, despite the discomfort, mistresses remained. The form had changed, but the pattern endured. Monarchs still strayed, their lovers still shaped history, and the public still gossiped. Only the tone shifted, from admiration to judgment, from quiet whispers to front-page scandal. So as you drift further into rest, picture yourself living in the 1950s or 1960s, when newspapers and cameras began to turn their gaze on royal households. Would you have taken the risk of being linked to a king, knowing that your face might appear not just in rumor, but in print, sold on every corner? Or would you have preferred the safer obscurity of a private life, untouched by royal drama? Let me know softly in the comments which path your dreaming mind would choose. By the late 20th century, the old rhythm of monarchy had collapsed. Empires were gone, revolutions had swept away crowns, and even the monarchies that remained were forced into the spotlight of modern media. Mistresses, once veiled in discreet silks and whispered about in salons, now lived under the harsh light of flashbulbs. What had once been private indulgence became public scandal. The British monarchy, naturally, became the centerpiece of this strange evolution. Charles, Prince of Wales, was bound by duty to marry Diana Spencer, a match that promised stability and the continuation of the dynasty. Diana was young, beautiful, and adored by the public, but Charles's heart had long belonged to Camilla Parker Bowles. Their affair, carried on both before and during his marriage, slowly unraveled not only the royal household, but also the monarchy's carefully curated image. For centuries, mistresses had been tolerated. Kings like Charles II had paraded them openly, and their children had been given titles and estates. But by the 1980s and 1990s, the game had changed. Instead of a courtly acceptance, there were paparazzi, tabloid exposés, and televised interviews. Diana's heartbreak became global property. Her phrases, "There were three of us in this marriage," etched into public memory. The mistress, once a private figure behind the curtain, had become the third character in a global soap opera. Camilla herself endured decades of vilification. To many, she was the interloper, the woman who had stolen away the heir to the throne's affections. Yet, in quiet irony, time would turn the narrative upside down. What once scandalized a nation became normalized. By the early 21st century, Camilla would not only be accepted, but eventually crowned as queen consort. The mistress had completed a journey no medieval courtier could have imagined, from scandalous lover to crown partner. Beyond Britain, other monarchies faced their own entanglements. King Juan Carlos of Spain, who had once been hailed as a modernizer after Franco's dictatorship, found himself ensnared in endless rumors of affairs. His most famous companion, Karina Larson, became the subject of investigations, interviews, and controversy. The Spanish public, already weary of corruption scandals, grew impatient. For them, mistresses no longer symbolized virility or charm. They symbolized outdated privilege, indulgence, and betrayal. In Monaco, the story took on a different shade. Prince Rainier's marriage to Grace Kelly seemed like a fairy tale, but even there, whispers of infidelity floated about the palace. Later generations of Grimaldis continued the tradition of tabloid-ready romances, affairs, and scandals. Mistresses, in such a tiny principality, were impossible to hide. They became part of Monaco's strange, theatrical identity, half soap opera, half dynasty. And in Belgium, the tale took a legal turn. Albert II, who reigned from 1993 to 2013, was sued over paternity claims. The question was not whether kings had mistresses, that was old news, but whether their illegitimate children would gain legal recognition. Here, in the final years of the 20th century, the centuries-old pattern of royal affairs collided with DNA testing and modern courts. The secrecy that had once shielded mistresses and their children dissolved under science and law. What we see in all of this is transformation. Mistresses had always existed, shaping royal lives and politics in hidden ways. But by the end of the 20th century, their existence was no longer private. They had become part of the public stage, their names debated, their faces photographed, their stories commodified. The romance, the heartbreak, the scandals. They were no longer whispers in a palace corridor. They were global narratives, watched by millions. And yet, the core pattern had not changed. Royals, however bound by ceremony, continued to fall in love, to stray, to entangle themselves in complicated affairs. The difference was that now the whole world was watching. As you sink deeper into calm, imagine yourself as one of those figures caught in the changing tide of the 20th century. Would you have wanted to be hidden in the background, tolerated but never truly acknowledged? Or would you have stepped into the spotlight, risking judgment but claiming your place in story? Tell me quietly in the comments which role your dream self would choose. By the 21st century, the mistress had lost much of her ancient glamour. Monarchies themselves had shrunk, reduced to ceremonial roles, symbolic pageantry, and the occasional headline scandal. Kings no longer commanded armies or reshaped empires. They cut ribbons, read speeches, and smiled at cameras. But even in this subdued environment, the old patterns of private indulgence still echoed faintly. The British royal family continued to lead the world in public fascination. The transformation of Camilla Parker Bowles from mistress to queen consort symbolized the survival of this tradition in a new form. What had once destroyed Charles's marriage and shaken a monarchy was eventually rebranded as a kind of resilience. Camilla was no longer the interloper. She was a steady partner, the woman who had endured decades of public hatred to emerge in pearls beside her husband. It was a curious irony. The scandal of one generation became the stability of the next. Elsewhere, echoes of the old world persisted. In Spain, King Juan Carlos's abdication in 2014 was shadowed not just by financial scandal, but by the lingering controversies of his private life. His longtime companion, Karina Larson, had become a fixture in European tabloids, not unlike the mistresses of old courts. Yet her story unfolded not in salons and gossip circles, but in newspapers, courtrooms, and interviews broadcast online. The royal mistress had been dragged fully into the modern world, her influence no longer hidden but contested and scrutinized. In Monaco, the Grimaldis carried forward their reputation as Europe's soap opera royals. Whispers of affairs and mistresses continued, though they were less shocking than they once might have been. In a way, the family's very survival depended on such stories. The palace became part fairy tale, part scandal magazine, a continuation of an ancient rhythm in a modern format. And in Belgium, the saga of Albert II and his illegitimate daughter Delphine Boll stretched into the 21st century, ending only when DNA testing confirmed her claims. For the first time in history, a royal mistress's child forced recognition through science. It was not politics or gossip that ended centuries of secrecy. It was a swab of the cheek. The mistress's role had been reframed not by courtiers, but by laboratories. If we look beyond Europe, monarchies in the Middle East and Asia provide another layer. Here, the word mistress is less commonly used, replaced by concept of official wives, consorts, or discreet companions. In some places, rulers maintain large households of partners, but these are often hidden from international media. What was once celebrated openly in Versailles or Whitehall is now carefully shielded, managed by press offices, and quietly ignored in official biographies. The difference in our century is visibility. Mistresses still exist in royal households, among the wealthy, in the shadows of power. But they exist in a world where every camera is a potential scandal, where every whisper can become a headline. The role is no longer glamorous. It is perilous, exhausting, and ultimately unsustainable. And yet, history never quite lets go. We still look back on the figures who once shaped dynasties with a mixture of fascination and bemusement. The mistress of the medieval king, who secured patronage for her family. The Renaissance courtesan, who influenced art and politics. The Georgian beauty, who shaped fashion and gossip. The Victorian scandal, whispered but never printed. The Edwardian confidant, standing just behind the throne. The 20th century mistress, splashed across newspapers and dissected on talk shows. All of them are threads in the same long tapestry. What we find, in the end, is that mistresses were less about sex and more about power. They revealed the weakness of kings who could not be content with duty. They showed the vulnerability of queens forced to endure humiliation. And they embodied the way private desires shape public history, in ways both absurd and tragic. As you lie here now, drifting towards sleep, you might wonder, was it worth it? Did these women find happiness in the palaces they entered, or only exhaustion and scandal? Would you have taken a risk? Had a king's eye fallen on you, knowing that your name might live forever in whispers or headlines? Or would you have chosen obscurity, safety, and a quiet life far from the throne? Tell me softly in the comments which choice your dreaming self would make. And that brings us to the end of this long, drowsy journey. From medieval castles to modern tabloids, from secret chambers to televised scandals, we've followed the strange endurance of the royal mistress. They were loved, hated, envied, and condemned. They shaped dynasties, ruined marriages, and sometimes even toppled crowns. And now, in our world of flashing cameras and endless headlines, they are fading away, becoming relics of a past that was never as glamorous as it pretended to be. Thank you for wandering through these centuries with me tonight. If you found this meandering story soothing, do remember to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep these quiet histories alive. And before you close your eyes, let me ask one last gentle question. If you could whisper to any one of these mistresses from history, offering a word of warning or comfort, who would it be, and what would you say?